Have you ever been the only person in the room who knew everyone was lying? Delilah Dawson lived that reality every single day. And on one gray Seattle morning, this shy girl who'd spent her entire life invisible was about to discover that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most power. The conference room sat high above the city, all glass walls and polished surfaces that reflected everything but revealed nothing. 12 executives circled the table in expensive suits, their faces professionally composed. At the head sat Asher Graham, 35, and already legendary for his ironclad rule data over feelings always. His divorce had taught him that people lie but numbers never do. Across from him stood Chelsea Brooks, head of strategy, delivering an expansion proposal with the kind of confidence that demanded applause. Her smile was perfect, her presentation flawless. But Delilah noticed what everyone else missed. The room had stopped breathing naturally. This heartwarming story begins in that moment of collective deception, when a shy girl sitting in the corner saw the truth nobody dared to speak. Delilah's hands rested motionless on her laptop. 27 years old, light brown hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing her usual minimalist gray cardigan. She wasn't supposed to speak at these meetings. Data analysts observed and reported later. They didn't interrupt. But Delilah possessed something rare. She could read the language everyone else ignored. Asher's knuckles had gone white against his pen. The CFO's eyes kept darting toward the exit. Chelsea's manicured hand trembled once barely visible, turning a page. Everyone smiled. Everyone nodded. But nobody trusted what was being said. That night, alone in her apartment, Delilah opened the anonymous feedback system and typed one sentence: "The room lacks psychological alignment." She never expected anyone to read it. What happened next would transform this inspirational journey from invisible analyst to the voice that changed everything. Asher Graham read every anonymous submission himself. After his wife's 2-year deception, he'd learned to look for truth in unexpected places. When Delilah's words appeared on his midnight screen, something shifted in his chest. Because he'd felt it too, that suffocating performance everyone had perfected. Someone else had been watching. Someone quiet. Someone he'd never really noticed. He pulled up the IP address, Building B, Floor 3, Station 47. He cross-referenced the chart. Delilah Dawson. He stared at her employee photo, then did something that would change both their lives. He scheduled a private meeting. But before that meeting could happen, Chelsea Brooks was already planning her next move. Because ambitious people always notice when someone invisible suddenly becomes visible. What happens when the person nobody sees becomes the only one who truly understands? Chelsea stood at her office window the next morning, watching Asher's assistant escort Delilah into the CEO's private office. Not the senior executives, not the department heads, the data analyst, the mouse who never spoke. Chelsea's perfectly manicured nails tapped her coffee cup as she timed it. 17 minutes. When Delilah emerged, clutching a folder like a shield, Chelsea intercepted her at the elevator. "Delilah, sweetheart." Her voice dripped false warmth. "I hope you're not wasting Mr. Graham's time with amateur psychology. This is a technology company, not a counseling center. We deal in hard metrics here, not feelings." Delilah's eyes met hers briefly. "He asked me to review some projections. That's all." The elevator doors closed, but both women knew it wasn't all. What Chelsea didn't know was that 3 months earlier she'd made a devastating error, a misplaced decimal in the Singapore expansion projection. $2.3 million off. The kind of mistake that ends careers. Delilah had caught it during a late-night audit. She could have reported it, watched Chelsea face consequences. Instead, she'd stayed until 3 in the morning, fixed everything, and resubmitted it under Chelsea's name. No announcement, no credit. Her mother, a surgical nurse for 37 years, had taught her that kindness doesn't need an audience. But kindness, Delilah was learning, could make you a target when the person you helped never knew you saved them. Over the next 2 weeks, Chelsea orchestrated a careful isolation campaign. Meeting invitations stopped arriving. Emails went unanswered. At team lunches, conversations would pause when Delilah approached, then shift direction once she sat down. The exclusion was surgical and devastatingly effective. Most people didn't notice, but Mr. Harold did. At 68, Harold had worked building security for 18 years. Most employees walked past without acknowledgement, but Harold had spent 23 years as a military personnel advisor before retiring here. He knew how to see the people everyone else overlooked. One evening, Harold appeared beside Delilah's cubicle as she packed her bag. "You're leaving earlier these days," he observed gently. "Work getting lighter or company getting heavier?" Delilah's hands stilled. She was too tired for polite lies. "I spoke up once," she said softly. "Now I'm learning that visibility isn't always welcome." Harold nodded slowly, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew an old fountain pen, its brass barrel etched with words. "Use it when truth feels heavy." "My lieutenant gave me this 42 years ago," Harold said. "I was 26, youngest advisor in my unit, terrified of saying the wrong thing. He told me something I've never forgotten: some battles aren't won with volume. They're won with one true sentence at exactly the right moment." Delilah took the pen, feeling its weight. What if speaking up just makes everything worse? Harold's smile held decades of wisdom. "Then you'll know you were in the wrong room. But something tells me you're exactly where you need to be. The question isn't whether you should speak. It's whether you'll forgive yourself if you don't." He touched his cap and walked away. That night, Delilah sat at her kitchen table, the pen beside her laptop, studying the company calendar. Major international meeting in 5 days, Mr. Tanaka from Tokyo, Chelsea leading, and Delilah wasn't even invited. She stared at the pen for a long time. Then she opened a new email to Asher. "Mr. Graham, I'd like to request permission to observe Thursday's client meeting. I believe my analytical background could provide valuable cultural context." 3 minutes of hovering before she pressed send. The response came at 11:47 p.m. One word: approved. Chelsea's fury when Delilah entered that conference room Thursday morning was palpable. Her smile stayed fixed, but her eyes went arctic. "How lovely. Our junior analyst joins us. Delilah dear, please stay quiet unless you have something concrete to contribute. Our international guests appreciate professionalism." The implication hung heavy: you don't belong here. Delilah took the seat at the far end, the chair reserved for people present but unimportant. She said nothing. But her eyes never stopped moving, watching, reading, waiting for the moment she knew was coming. Sometimes the quietest preparation leads to the loudest impact. Mr. Tanaka arrived precisely at 9 with 2 associates. Delilah observed everything: his firm but brief handshake, his courteous, measured smile, the careful way he settled into his chair. 53, she estimated. Traditional values. He would respond to respect and partnership, poorly to aggression. Chelsea launched into her presentation with polished intensity. The proposal was bold, designed to project invincibility. She spoke of market dominance, crushing competitors, seizing opportunity. This partnership will position both companies as Pacific leaders. We're not just offering opportunity, we're offering the chance to be on the winning side before the war begins. Every word calculated to inspire confidence. But Delilah watched Mr. Tanaka's face begin to close. The shift was subtle. His shoulders drew back slightly. His hands, previously open on the table, folded together, creating a barrier. His associate glanced at him, twice a silent question. Chelsea, focused on her performance, never noticed she was losing the room. Asher noticed. His attention shifted from screen to client, brow furrowing, but he said nothing. This was Chelsea's meeting. 20 minutes in Chelsea made her final push. Mr. Tanaka, this partnership will make us unstoppable. We're asking you to recognize an opportunity you cannot afford to miss. The market waits for no one. She sat down, triumphant. The silence felt like held breath. Mr. Tanaka's face was professionally neutral. Too neutral. Delilah recognized that expression, someone preparing to say yes while meaning no, already composing tomorrow's polite rejection email. She glanced at Harold's pen in her pocket. Use it when truth feels heavy. The truth felt like a stone in her throat. Everyone waited for Mr. Tanaka to speak. He opened his mouth. Excuse me. Delilah's quiet voice carried like a bell in the silence. Every head turned. Chelsea's smile froze. I think there may be a misunderstanding in our messaging. She looked directly at Mr. Tanaka. You're not uncomfortable with the proposal itself. You're uncomfortable with how we're presenting it. With the tone. The room stopped breathing. Chelsea's face flushed. Delilah, I don't think... Let her finish. Asher's voice carried absolute authority. Go on. Delilah's heart hammered, but she'd already jumped. In Japanese business culture, partnership means equality and mutual respect. But our language has been about conquest and dominance. We've been talking to you like someone we're trying to defeat, not someone we want to stand beside. She paused, watching his face carefully. I think what we mean to say is that we see this as an opportunity to learn from each other, to create something neither could create alone. Not to crush markets, but to serve them. To build value that helps people, your people and ours, together as equals. The silence stretched endlessly. Then Mr. Tanaka's hands slowly unfolded. He leaned back, and something genuine crossed his face. He smiled. Yes, that is what partnership means. That is what I came hoping to find. He looked at Asher. Your analyst understands what many executives never learn. Business is not war. It is relationship. If you remember this, we have much to discuss. The meeting continued 90 more minutes, but everything had changed. Chelsea struggled to regain control, but the conversation had shifted into something genuine and exploratory. By the time Mr. Tanaka stood to leave preliminary partnership, planning was approved. At the door, he paused, looking past Chelsea and Asher directly at Delilah. Thank you for your honesty, for your respect. Then he was gone. The room emptied quickly. Chelsea gathered materials with shaking hands. Other executives filed out, murmuring. Finally, only Asher and Delilah remained. He stood at the window, hands in pockets, looking at the city below. Kun, how did you know what he was thinking? Delilah closed her laptop slowly. Because I know what it feels like to be talked at instead of talked to feel conquered instead of understood. When you're invisible, you learn to see things others miss. Watching is all you can do. Asher turned. The professional armor he always wore had cracked. That submission about psychological alignment, I've read it 47 times. You saw something I've been ignoring for months. What's that? His voice dropped. That I've been so focused on never being fooled again that I stopped letting anyone close enough to tell me the truth. They stood in quiet understanding, two people who'd spent their lives watching from margins, finally seeing each other clearly. Then Asher's phone buzzed. The moment broke. We should get back to work. But as Delilah headed for the door, she heard him say quietly, almost like he didn't mean for her to hear, Thank you, Delilah. for speaking, for trusting me to listen. Outside, Harold waited by the elevator, that knowing twinkle in his eyes. He touched his cap. She touched the pen in her pocket. She'd used it at the right moment, but the truth hadn't gotten lighter. If anything, it had become heavier. Because now people knew she could speak. And they'd be watching what she said next. When you speak one truth, you can't predict which lies will come for you. The rumor started quietly spreading through whispered conversations. By Monday, 3 people had mentioned it to Delilah. By Tuesday, she felt the looks, sympathetic, uncomfortable, knowing. "I need to tell you something." Marie, her cubicle neighbor, leaned over. "Chelsea's been talking. She's saying you've been using manipulation tactics on Mr. Graham, exploiting his personal history to gain influence, making him distrust his leadership team so you can position yourself as his only confidant." Delilah's fingers froze on her keyboard. "That's not true." "I know, honey," Marie said gently, "but Chelsea's been here 6 years. She has allies everywhere. And you." The implication hung unspoken. "You're nobody. You have no power. You can't fight this." By Wednesday morning, an email arrived from HR. "Due to departmental restructuring, your position will transition to focus exclusively on back-end data analysis. Effective immediately, you'll be reassigned to the secondary analytics team. Please coordinate project handoffs." Delilah read it 3 times, each time feeling colder. Removed from strategic meetings, pulled from executive visibility, sent back where data analysts were supposed to stay, seen rarely, heard never. By Thursday, she was packing her desk. Her hands moved mechanically, a framed photo of her mother in nursing scrubs before the cancer, a hand-painted mug from her grandmother Harold's pen. She held it, reading the etched words through blurring vision. "Use it when truth feels heavy." She'd used it. This was the price. "Do you regret it?" Asher's voice came from behind. She turned to find him at her cubicle entrance, tie loosened. Around them, the office had gone silent, everyone watching. Regret what? Though she knew exactly what he meant. Speaking up, telling the truth when it cost you something. He gestured at the box, the half-empty desk, the visible evidence of her fall. Delilah set the pen carefully in the box. "No, I don't regret speaking. I regret not saying it sooner. I regret all the times I stayed silent when I knew something was wrong. I regret thinking that if I just kept my head down, stayed invisible, I'd be safe." She looked at him. "Because it doesn't work that way. Silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you complicit in your own invisibility." Pain flickered across Asher's face. "I was married once. 3 years. She told me she loved me every morning. Said all the right words, performed devotion perfectly." He paused. "The entire time she was deceiving me. About where she went, who she saw, what she wanted. When I finally discovered the truth, I promised myself I'd never trust words over data again. I thought if I just focused on measurable facts, I'd never be that vulnerable again." "And has it worked?" Delilah asked softly. "Have you felt safer?" His silence was answer enough. "I'm sorry this happened," Asher said finally. "You were right about everything, but I can't override HR without documented cause. It would look like favoritism. It would prove exactly what Chelsea's been saying, that you've manipulated me into emotional decisions." "I understand how power works," Delilah said, picking up her box. "Who gets believed and who doesn't?" She started past him, then stopped close enough to speak without the office hearing. "You asked how I knew what Mr. Tanaka was thinking. The truth is, I see it in everyone. Every meeting. Every conversation. When people are afraid, lying, performing, hurting." She looked at him directly. "I see it in you too. You're not protecting yourself by trusting data over people. You're just ensuring that when you're betrayed again, and you're so convinced it will happen that you're practically guaranteeing it, you can tell yourself the numbers failed, not your judgment. You're building a fortress where you can be alone, but call it being safe. Asher's face went still. "You're wrong," he said, but without conviction. "Maybe," Delilah said. "But you asked if I regret speaking. The answer is no, because at least I tried. At least I was honest. I don't have to lie to myself about why I'm alone." She walked away carrying her box, feeling 24 pairs of eyes following. Behind her, Asher stood frozen, her words echoing like truth he'd been avoiding. That night, Delilah sat in her apartment, Harold's pen on the table. Her phone buzzed. Harold's text, "The right words don't always bring immediate reward, but they plant seeds that grow in darkness. Trust the process." She stared at the message. Then she picked up the pen and began writing. Not a resignation, not anger, just a document titled, "The Hidden Costs of Communication Failure in Executive Decision-Making." She wrote about 3 years of silent observation. Fear masked as aggression. Insecurity disguised as confidence. People performing agreement instead of expressing honest concern. How companies lose millions, not because data is wrong, but because conversations are dishonest. Because silence becomes complicity, becomes culture. When she finished at 3:47 a.m., her coffee was cold, her eyes burned. But she'd said everything that needed saying. She attached it to an email addressed to Asher Graham. Her cursor hovered over send. She thought of her mother fixing surgical errors at midnight. Harold believing she was exactly where she needed to be. Mr. Tanaka's face when she'd spoken the truth he'd been hoping someone would say. She pressed send. Then she went to bed, uncertain about tomorrow's job status, but certain for the first time in 27 years that she'd said exactly what needed to be said, regardless of consequences. 3 weeks passed like fog. Delilah settled into her new role, processing data in a quiet second-floor corner. No more strategic meetings. Chelsea's campaign had succeeded, but something strange was happening. Executives she'd never spoken to started appearing at her desk, asking questions, requesting her perspective, mentioning casually that Asher had forwarded something she'd written. "Brilliant analysis," the CFO said one Tuesday. "That piece about communication patterns made me rethink our entire review process." Then 3 weeks after her reassignment, an email arrived. "All staff meeting, mandatory attendance, quarterly review, 2 p.m., main auditorium." When Delilah entered, she found it packed, every employee filling seats. At the front, Asher stood alone at the podium. No slides, no notes. Just him. When he saw her take a seat near the back, his eyes found hers and held briefly. Something passed between them, acknowledgement perhaps, or preparation. Then he began to speak. Sometimes the truth you speak in darkness becomes the light everyone was waiting for. Asher's voice carried unusual weight across the silent auditorium. "I've been thinking about what we measure in this company. Revenue, growth, market share, efficiency, all critical metrics. But there's something we don't measure that might matter more than any number on any spreadsheet." He paused. "We don't measure honesty. We don't measure whether people feel safe telling us when something's wrong. We don't measure the cost of everything that never gets said, because people learned that speaking up is dangerous." He gestured to the screen. Delilah's anonymous submission filled the enormous display. "The room lacks psychological alignment." An employee sent this after a strategic meeting. One sentence. "I almost dismissed it as too vague, too emotional, not actionable." He looked at where Delilah sat, heart pounding. I was wrong. That sentence saved us from a partnership approach that would have failed spectacularly. Not because our data was wrong, but because our cultural understanding was non-existent. One person saw what we all missed. One person was brave enough to say it despite having no authority, no power, no reason to believe anyone would listen. Colleagues' eyes began searching for who he meant. Chelsea, sitting in the third row with perfect posture, had gone pale. Over the past month, I've learned something devastating. We have incredibly talented people, but many have stopped telling us what they really see. They've learned that observation without seniority is unwelcome, that quiet analysis is less valued than loud confidence, that being right matters less than being connected, that speaking truth carries more risk than staying silent. He advanced to the next slide. Chelsea's financial error appeared, the miscalculation highlighted in red. $2.3 million. A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. 3 months ago, a critical miscalculation appeared in a strategic projection. If this error had gone unnoticed, we would have lost a $7 million partnership and damaged our reputation across multiple Pacific markets. Chelsea's knuckles whitened on her armrests. People nearby were staring. But someone caught it, Asher continued. Someone working late Thursday night doing a routine audit nobody asked her to do. Someone who could have reported the error publicly watched a senior colleague face consequences, used the information to advance her own position. He paused. Instead, she stayed until 3 a.m, recalculated everything, and resubmitted the corrected report under the original author's name. She protected a colleague's reputation while protecting the company's future, quietly, expecting nothing in return, never telling anyone. The auditorium was completely silent. And when that same colleague later worked to have her removed from strategic meetings, when rumors were spread about manipulation and inappropriate influence, when her career was being systematically dismantled, she never once mentioned what she'd done. Never used her knowledge as leverage or defense. He looked directly at Chelsea. Ms. Brooks, the person who saved you from a career-ending mistake was Delilah Dawson. Chelsea's face went through shock, denial, realization, shame in 3 seconds. People were whispering. Asher turned to the full auditorium. Ms. Dawson, would you please stand? Delilah's body went numb. Around her, colleagues turned, searching, finding her. Slowly, on trembling legs, she stood, every eye fixed on her. Starting today, Delilah Dawson will lead a new department, Human Insight. Her role will be observing our communication patterns, decision-making processes, organizational health, and the gaps between what we say and what we mean. She'll have direct access to all strategic meetings and executive planning. She'll report findings directly to leadership and the board. And most importantly, she'll be empowered to speak up when she sees something we're missing. He paused, letting it settle. There will be no retaliation for her observations, no consequences for honest feedback, no punishment for telling us truths we don't want to hear. Because we've learned that the people we ignore are often the ones seeing most clearly. Applause started slowly, tentative at first, then building. People began standing. The sound filled the auditorium like a wave. Delilah stood frozen, overwhelmed, tears blurring her vision. One more thing, Asher said when the noise faded. Chelsea Brooks has been reassigned to our Denver office effective next week. She'll continue as a senior strategist but will no longer hold managerial authority. This isn't punishment, it's acknowledgement that leadership requires trust, and trust requires honesty, something we'd all forgotten. Chelsea stood without a word, her professional mask cracking. She walked up the aisle as the crowd parted. At the door, she paused and looked back at Delilah. Their eyes met. Chelsea's expression was complex anger, yes, but also recognition. Understanding that Delilah had shown her more grace than she'd deserved. Then she was gone. After the meeting, the auditorium emptied slowly. People approached Delilah, shaking her hand, congratulating her, sharing stories of their own silent moments. 40 minutes later, the room finally cleared. Harold waited by the exit, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You used the pen at the right time." Delilah pulled it from her pocket and held it out. "You should keep it for the next person who needs it." Harold shook his head gently, closing her fingers around it. "No. That pen was always meant for you. I just held it until you were ready." He placed his hand over hers. "You don't need it anymore. You found your own voice. But keep it to remember that courage doesn't shout. It whispers truth when everyone else has learned to lie. And sometimes that whisper changes everything. Recognition changes everything, but it doesn't erase the journey that earned it." 1 year later, Delilah stood in the same glass conference room where everything had changed. The Seattle skyline stretched behind her, the sky clear, the city bright. Around the table sat 12 people, different faces, now younger, nervous, all new members of the Human Insight program she'd built. "You're going to see things other people miss," she told them, her voice steady with earned authority. "You'll notice when someone's afraid, when they're lying to themselves, and everyone else when the room performs agreement, but feels doubt. And you'll be tempted to stay quiet about it." She paused, recognizing herself in their uncertainty. Because speaking up is uncomfortable. It makes you visible. It makes you vulnerable. It sometimes makes you a target. A young woman in the back, maybe 24, raised her hand tentatively. "What if we're wrong? What if we speak up and just embarrass ourselves?" This heartwarming moment reminded Delilah of asking Harold the same question. She smiled. "Then you're wrong. And we'll learn together. We'll calibrate your observations. But staying silent because you might be wrong, that's how companies lose millions. That's how people get hurt. That's how truth dies quietly while everyone pretends everything is fine. I'd rather you speak up and be wrong than stay silent and be right." Outside the window, the city moved through afternoon rhythms. Asher appeared in the doorway, watching quietly. When the meeting ended and the new analysts filed out, chatting nervously, excited, hopeful, he stepped inside. "They're lucky to learn from you," he said. "You're teaching them something it took me 35 years to understand." "What's that?" "That being vulnerable isn't weakness. That admitting you don't have all the answers isn't failure. That people who watch and listen often understand more than people who talk and decide." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned to trust each other through fire. Somewhere far below, Mr. Harold made his evening rounds. His shift ended at 6. Now Asher had promoted him to Director of Security Culture, a position created to honor what he'd always done unofficially. Delilah pulled Harold's pen from her jacket and signed her daily observation log, the brass catching late afternoon light. The etched words had worn smooth from a year of handling. "Use it when truth feels heavy." She looked at Asher. "Do you ever worry about saying the wrong thing?" He considered thoughtfully. "Every single day. But I worry more about saying nothing at all. About letting fear make me silent. About building walls so high that truth can't reach me." He smiled slightly. "You taught me that. The cost of being wrong is temporary, but the cost of staying silent is permanent." Their eyes met. No dramatic confession. No romantic declaration. Just understanding. Just recognition. Just two people who'd learned that the most important conversations are always the ones we're most afraid to have. Through the window, 17 floors below, Mr. Harold looked up toward the executive offices. He couldn't see them, but somehow Delilah felt his presence, the silent guardian who'd seen her when she was invisible, and believed in her when belief felt impossible. She picked up her bag and headed for the door. "Delilah," Asher called softly. She turned. "Thank you for not staying quiet, for being brave enough to speak when it mattered, for showing all of us what leadership actually looks like." She smiled. "Thank you for finally listening, for being brave enough to hear what you didn't want to know, for showing all of us that people can change." The city lights flickered on as evening approached. Behind her, the past, all the silence, all the invisibility, all the fear. Ahead, possibility stretching like an open road. And in her pocket, a pen that had taught her the most important lesson, that sometimes courage isn't shouting. It's daring to say the right thing when everyone else is silent. And that single moment of bravery can echo forward, changing everything that comes after. This inspirational story of one shy girl who found her voice reminds us that the quietest people often see the most clearly, and that speaking truth, even when it's terrifying, is the most powerful thing any of us can do. The end of one journey is always the beginning of another.